before I started this work, I was in transition. At least I hoped I was in transition. And so I worked at a golf course one summer because I thought that I liked golfing. I thought that would be fun. Turns out it's much more fun to golf than to work at a golf course, which you shouldn't need to be a Mensa member to know. But anyways, so one of the women I worked with, she worked on the food side at the clubhouse. Anyway, she went out to marshal at one of the holes, which means if you're not a golfer, just to make sure things are moving along, people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And when she came back, I said, so how was that? And she goes, you know what? Most people aren't very good. So, it was comforting. We like to talk a good game. So thanks for that lovely introduction, for inviting me to be with you here in your church and to be able to share a little bit about your work, or about my work. I'm a substitute. The original person had some dental surgery and so wasn't able to be with you. She does beautiful work at one of our drop-ins and we have a women-only shelter, which is something new for the city and for us. And so I come with a little bit different experience, and so that's where I'll be speaking out of. And my work is with women who've been in prison. And I've been doing that, coming up on my 11th work anniversary, and for a year before that I volunteered at the prison, which I'd always been interested in prison ministry, but I didn't know how to get in, so I could get out kind of at the end of the day. And but anyways, so I applied for this job twice, didn't get it the first time. A year later, I applied again, and here I am many years later. I love it. I love my work. I love working with people who are working so hard to change and to do something different with their lives. The sense of humor that people have is just amazing. I just thought I'd start off with a couple stories because I just think it's funny. So one of the times at the prison, one of the institutional chaplains was away, so I was filling in and asked to go down to the maximum security unit. Now here's like a really, really quick little tutorial on the Canadian justice system. We have 2 levels of prisons in Canada, provincial and federal. If your sentence is under 2 years, you go to provincial jail. If your sentence is 2 years or longer, you go to federal prison. And so we use those 2 words kind of interchangeably, but they actually do technically mean different things. In Edmonton, there is the federal prison for the Prairie region for women, and it's just over on the west end. You might have driven by it, the Edmonton Institution for Women, and it's a multi-security level facility. So you have minimum security women there, you have medium security women, and you have maximum security. So I was down on the max, and I'd taken some supplies for the women to make cards so that we would have something to do together while we kind of got to know each other, because we really believe that support comes through relationship. And knowing someone, being known by someone is something very sacred. And so that little card making thing was something to do. So I had never met the women before. And so anyways, they're making cards. I said, one of the things you might want to do is on the back, you can put your name, like made by or whatever. So as one woman finished her card, she showed it to me. I flipped it over. She wanted me to see the back of it. She had this great little cartoon of a little face, a couple of arms, hands around bars, and made in prison. And we laughed. One of the cornerstones to our support is a support group. So every other Saturday, we have a meeting for people who are on parole, the various kinds of parole, and sometimes when we're not in the middle of a pandemic or near the end of a pandemic, we bring women on. It's called a temporary absence, and I've done the training so I can escort people, and we bring people from the prison to the group and then take them back at the end of it. And so I was driving some women back to the prison, and it was kind of in the fall. We're driving down Jasper Avenue, and somebody sees something in a store window that she likes, and she says, oh, that looks nice. So someone else is like, hey, you should ask for it for Christmas. And so people laugh. And then someone else says, well, have you been good? And she's like, no, I'm in jail. We laughed. On the minimum security unit, there's a desk, and an officer sits at it, a correctional officer. Old school language, a guard is sitting there. And when you're in prison, you're allowed to have some of your own clothes there, but you also are issued institutional clothing, which are sweatpants, sweatshirts. So 2 women, I'm assuming they were institutional clothing, so dressed pretty similarly, came up to the desk and said to the officer there, who happened to be a guy, which one of us looks best in this outfit? And he, without missing a beat, says, I have worked long enough in a women's institution to know that I should not answer that question. And what's next? What's next? Does this make me look fat? He's like, and we killed ourselves laughing. It was so funny. All kinds of funny moments happen like that. But it's not all fun and games. I work with women that are working on themselves. They come to chaplaincy voluntarily. They're reaching out for support. They're leaning into their best lives. I have lost track, seriously, of how many times I've been told by women that going to prison was the best thing that ever happened to them. How it saved their lives. How it interrupted horribly destructive cycles of addiction and crime and danger and violence. One woman who hated her life told me she had decided to end it. She actually had gathered what she needed and put it on the coffee table and went out for one last errand and was arrested before she came home. Never went back. Found life and freedom, and she's living her dream now. She's clean, sober, and free in ways that she never was before she went to prison. I know when we watch the news, we don't hear those stories. We hear the bad news stories. We hear about people on parole offending. We hear about horrible offenses that human beings commit against one another. Can I tell you today that there are people that go to prison that come out transformed, that come out determined to live a different way, that come out determined to be contributors to the community instead of antisocial. People reconciling with their past, owning their decisions, growing and healing. And this isn't every prison story, but I'm telling you, it's not unique. It happens. There's no excuse for crime, but there is always an explanation. So when I went to Bible college many years ago, I made a few friends, and so this one friend of mine knows what I do and sent me a message and said, my daughter's friend's mom is in trouble and she's going to be going to prison. Can you help her? So I said, sure, I'll try. And she gave me her name. I'll use mine. And so I went looking for Debbie Faucet in the records that I had access to, and I couldn't find her. So as I mentioned earlier, jail, prison, not everybody knows the difference. And so maybe she went to provincial. And so after I looked for her for a while, I kind of forgot about her. One Sunday I went and I was filling in for the chaplain at the service. And at the end of it, a woman came up to me and she said, hi, I'm Debbie Faucet. And I went, Debbie Faucet, I've been looking for you. And she's got this very embarrassed look on her face. And she's like, yeah, well, here I am. And I kind of interrupted her, which is not a good practice, but in this case, it was the right thing to do. And I'm like, you know what? I know there's a backstory. And I watched relief just wash over her face. She realized she wasn't being judged for the decisions that she'd made. Have you ever been a jerk and tried to make up for it? I know I have. You know, I wish when you were driving that there was a hand signal, some sort of gesture to say, sorry, my bad, I know I was an idiot, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. I mean, I know there's a gesture if you want to sort of convey that to someone else, but I mean, I wish there was a gesture that clearly said, I messed up and I'm sorry. You know, what I'm searching for is an important step in restorative justice. Restorative justice, there's a term that I had never heard before my involvement at the women's prison. The first year I was there, I was invited to Restorative Justice Day. I had no idea what that was, but it sounded cool, and it was at the prison, so I was up for it. So I went to this Restorative Justice Day, and I was hoping that someone would explain kind of along the way what restorative justice was. It never did happen, or I missed it. That's totally possible. So the next year when Restorative Justice Day came around, I was like, can I do a workshop? And I did kind of a Restorative Justice 101. And so let me share with you um, what restorative justice is. You know, it isn't one thing. It's an approach, it's a theory, it's a philosophy, it's a process. It's often used in the context of crime, but it has application wherever people are in relationship with one another. Because wherever we are in relationship with one another, we have the capacity to cause harm. So schools, the workplace, families, churches, relationships. The drive of restorative justice is to make things as right as possible. When harm happens, restorative justice says, let's make things as right as possible. So since none of us has a working time machine and can go back to pre-harm conditions, as right as possible is the best we can hope for this side of heaven. This is a kingdom of God message that's being explored beautifully in this series. Relationships restored with God, with each other, with ourselves, with creation. Restorative justice has three bedrock beliefs. And the first one is that no one should be given up on. You know that expression, lock them up and throw away the key? I don't think that's God's heart for anybody. You know what? There are people who are dangerous. I heard at one of these restorative justice days, I heard a police officer say, we tend to lock up people we're mad at. We should just lock up people we're afraid of. There are dangerous people, and they need to be where they're safe and where others are safe. But no one should be given up on. Every human being created in the image of God. That means no one's beyond hope. No one is a throwaway. Even if sin has marred that image into something that we have a hard time accepting, the love of God compels us to love our neighbor. And restorative justice is one expression of love. I was introduced to a book when I started this work called Tattoos on the Heart. It's written by a Jesuit priest who does work down in Los Angeles. He went to be a pastor in an area that was just riddled with gangs and did all kinds of work, started a bakery so they could have jobs. It's become an industry, and it's a really great book if you're looking for something wonderful to read. But he says that no one is a throwaway. And I had the supreme privilege of going to a gathering that he did a couple years ago. And so at our restorative justice group, we played his TED Talk. His name's Gregory Boyle. And in there, he talks about how no one's a throwaway. And so one of the women at the group said to me, we were talking what really touched you from that talk. And she said, I'm not a throwaway. Like her family had written her off. Her mother, her daughters, just didn't want to have anything to do with her. Just completely done with her. And I understand there's a place for boundaries. There's a place for healthy boundaries. So lots of tension in life, right? But anyways, they were done with her. But she was rediscovering the worth in her own self and realizing that she wasn't a throwaway. And she said, if you get to meet Father Greg, can you tell him that I'm being recycled? And I did get a chance at the reception they had the first night, just with some careful stalking and like arranging yourself, did get to meet him. And I saw other people doing that, because that's what you do. And I saw people, you can read lips. I loved your book. I'm like, okay, I got to say something besides that. And I'm like, oh yeah, this woman, her name actually happens to be Debbie. Debbie wanted me to say this on her behalf. And we had this lovely moment, just acknowledging that Debbie's not a throwaway. A next bedrock piece of restorative justice is that we're all connected. I've watched the last couple of messages, and that was part of Tyler's message a couple weeks ago. We're all connected. We need to take relationships seriously, understanding ourselves as part of an interconnected web of people. A number of years ago, there was a situation with some conflict, and I wasn't really in the middle of it, but I was kind of affected. And I sort of wondered what I should do, what part I needed to play in it. And I remember it crossed my mind, nothing. Let it go. I think they're moving to Newfoundland. I don't think it's going to be something I really need to spend any time on. And I realized I was treating these people like they were disposable, like it was about whether I needed them or not. That's not a restorative justice kind of an attitude. Restorative justice says we need each other. We're connected. Our relationships matter. Not regardless of the magnitude of our relationship, it matters. And the third bedrock piece is acknowledging that we can cause harm. You know, it's so much nicer to think of ourselves as the peacemaker, the reconciler. But before we ever get to that place, we have to acknowledge that we can cause harm. Because it would seem that to be human is to cause harm. In any relationship in my life, from the longest term and most intimate, with my husband, my family, to the most brief and distant, person taking my drive-through order or the person I share the road with on my drive to work. I lived for a number of years in eastern Ontario and in a place called Gananoque, which is just east of Kingston, and it's where the Gananoque River meets the St. Lawrence River. And so people are really into water culture there and boating and stuff. And so someone in the church took me out on their boat, and we went down one of the rivers, I guess. There's a big harbor, and you can tell, like, this prairie girl was really faking it. All these boats are parked there, you know. Anyways, there was a sign, and it said, "You are responsible for your wake." So that means if you rip through this waterway and your wake makes boats smash up against their docks, it's on you. You have a wake, whether you're paddling a canoe or driving a big speedboat. Number one, you make a wake, and number two, you're responsible for it. Going to the passage that we read this morning, it comes out of a section that my Bible gave the title, Love, to. And there are bullet points here on all the different ways we can love each other. Harold's message last week reminded us to love ourselves and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And this passage gives us some ideas on how to do that. And I want to highlight verse 18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, be at peace with everyone. Never let you be the reason for an unpeaceful relationship with another person. You know, I love this verse. I just think it's so beautiful because it's so realistic. It says, it acknowledges that it's not always possible. Sometimes we've had unpeaceful relationships with someone who's died, and there's nothing we can do right now about that. Or with someone who refuses to be in a relationship with us, or for someone who is not safe for us. They're toxic, and we can't be in a peaceful relationship with them. So he says, if possible, and so far as it depends on you. Our own ego, pride, desires, prejudices should never get in the way of living peaceably with others. And he says, don't take revenge. You know, we love revenge stories. We love it where the bad guy gets it, where justice is done. When Dr. Phil first was on TV, I liked it. I don't watch it anymore, but I did in the early days. And so I'm watching it one afternoon, and it says, if you're ever in the LA area, join us for taping. I'm like, too bad I'm never in the LA area. And then I remembered we were taking the kids to Disneyland. I'm like, hey, maybe we could get in on this. So, I called the 1-800 number. I think this might have predated the internet. I'm not even sure. This is an old story. But anyways, so sure enough, we could get tickets. So only adults were allowed, and a friend actually was traveling with us, so he looked after the kids. And so anyways, but they don't tell you what it's going to be about till you're actually there in the audience, and it all starts. So I'm hoping that it's not going to be couples who swing, and then they pan the audience, and there's Brad and I here. So no idea what it was going to be about. But anyways, it turns out it's going to be about anger and revenge. So I'm like, this is not the funniest topic in the world, but whatever. And so they filmed the 2 segments that were going to make that episode. And then they said, hey, it's your lucky day, folks. We're doing a bonus episode. And so just stay put. We're going to film this bonus episode. Well, it was this woman who, her cheating husband had loved sports memorabilia and had spent a lot of money on sports memorabilia without her knowing it, and had secreted it away in a storage unit somewhere. Well, anyway, she found out about it, and so the revenge piece was that she was selling it all off dirt cheap. And so the audience loved it. Like, you go, girl. And I mean, they're just cheering her on, and they just think this is a great story. So as Dr. Phil kind of starts to unpack the story with her, he finally asks her, is it what you hoped for? She's like, well, not really. Not as satisfying as I had hoped it would be. God knows that. He knows that our attempts at revenge are cheap. They don't accomplish anything good, not for the offender and not for the offended. Restorative justice is a principle that started with God, that says when harm has been committed, things need to be made right. There's a great account of a man that encountered Jesus and had his life changed. His name was Zacchaeus. He was a tax collector. Now, for those of you who work for the CRA, we don't hate you. But Zacchaeus, in Bible times, tax collectors were hated because, first of all, they were imposed by a government and like an oppressive nation that had invaded ours. And a tax collector was one of your own who was doing the dirty work of the government and taking a little off the top for himself. So scum of the earth in the eyes of most people. But Jesus saw value. So much value that he said, hey, I'm going to come home with you and have supper with you. And he treated Zacchaeus like the human being that he was, worthy of respect, worthy of honor. And what was Zacchaeus' response? He says, I'm going to give back to the poor. I'm going to pay back with interest the people I've cheated. There would have been lots of people in the crowd that day that thought he was without a soul and unworthy of anyone's efforts to reform him. Jesus thought otherwise, and Zacchaeus' experience with a loving God had a ripple effect in this community. The restorative and reformative work of God in his life made his community a better place to be. I was chatting with Cheryl before the beginning of this service, and a story of one of the women came back to me. So she had been involved in crime. She was doing a sentence for manslaughter, and just a tragic, tragic story. She got out of prison. She came to the Mustard Seed. We had a women's employment program at the time. She started working in that employment program. She got her own place when she got out of the halfway house. Anyway, she got her first check. Now, when you look at your pay stub and you look to see how much income taxes come off, maybe you do a little dance of joy, I'm not sure. But this woman looked at her paycheck and saw the income tax and went, I'm contributing to the community, not taking from it. She was transformed. The world was a better place because of the restoration that was taking place in her life. She loved paying her rent. That was one of her favorite days of the month when she got to pay her rent. The community is a better place when we live restoratively. In the parable of the prodigal son, Jesus addresses the question, how do we treat offenders? My first day at the prison, I went through the principal entrance, and there were, right across the hallway, there were two washrooms. One said staff, one said offenders. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I guess the women get told over and over and over again that they are offenders. God has another name for them. And I hope we do too. But Jesus addresses the question, how do we treat offenders? And he says the way the wayward son is welcomed back is how we should treat offenders. Remember that prodigal son came repentant and came acknowledging the harm that he had caused. But what met him there was not more judgment, not shame, not blame, but reconciliation, healed relationships, and the understanding of God as merciful. Our God loves and always authors restorative stories. So there's a rhythm to living restoratively. Harm happens and it affects relationships. So if we're going to live restoratively, our next step is to confess it. It's to own it. There's a common misconception that everybody in prison is saying, I didn't do it. Now, again, I work with people who are looking for support and are healing. There's one woman that I work with who has maintained her innocence for her murder conviction. One woman who said that she didn't kill her baby, she dropped her baby by accident. And I saw on a CBC show the other day, they investigated the coroner that did autopsies and found out he had a whole raft of ones that he had done wrong that they're disputing. And she was on that show actually as someone who had gone to prison because of his decisions, and they're revisiting her story. But other than those two women, every woman I've ever worked with is like, I did it. I did it. And we will never live restorative lives if we can't own the harm we cause. Part of owning it is not explaining it away. It's not deflecting it. It's not, as I said earlier, there's no excuse, but there's always an explanation. We can explain, but if we make excuses, we're not owning it. If we try to minimize it, we're not owning it. So to fully own the harm that we cause, and then to change, to acknowledge what in me made me make that decision. Why would I have done that? That kind of reflective self-examination, and then taking the necessary steps, and then restitution, that making things as right as possible, that paying things back. Those are the conditions for healing and for peace. And whether the harm is small or whether the harm is great, the principles remain the same. Very briefly, here's an example. It was a Friday morning, it was my day off, I was going to have coffee with a friend, completely forgot, did not show up. Later I get an email from her like, is everything okay? Missed you this morning. I'm like, ugh, yikes. I've caused some harm to that relationship. So it starts off with her questions. Has something bad happened? Were you so sick you forgot? Did something happen to you on your way? So I discover that I've stood up a friend, and she discovers that I've been careless. I've broken trust. And so I need to own it. I need to apologize. I need to not make excuses, but just own it. And I ask for an opportunity to meet up, and of course I'm buying coffee. The relationship's restored because I want to make things right, and because so does she. She allows me to. In Rwanda, you're probably familiar with the story of the genocide that happened in April of 1994. There's a retired institutional chaplain that's doing work in Rwanda and Burundi around the genocide, and started training chaplains and said, you need to listen to people. And so chaplains started doing more than just holding services, but listening to people. And the name of the chaplain is Pierre Allard. You can find this story on YouTube if you Google his name. It's in 3 parts, but he tells the story of the Letters Project, of once people started reflecting on what had happened, these perpetrators of the genocide, people who had murdered their neighbors as part of an ethnic cleansing, were coming to terms with what they had done. And so out of these people reflecting, there came this desire to make things as right as possible. And so this thing started called the Letters Project. So people started writing letters to the families of their victims, asking for forgiveness. And as Pierre says, that's not a letter you put in the mail. It has to be hand-delivered. The person has to be prepared for it. And so this was happening. A man took a letter, and he went out into the countryside to look for a particular village, to look for a particular woman. So he's out in the countryside. He's kind of at a road. A woman walks by. She greets him, asks him what he's doing. I'm looking for this village. I'm looking for this woman. And she says, well, that's me. And he says, well, I have a letter here from the man that killed your parents and your children. Do you want to receive it? And she said, yes, I do. And so she received the letter, and the next step was, do you want to meet him? And the facilitators of this project had some space so they could bring the offender in and the family member, and he had a chaplain and she had a chaplain, and then this Pierre Allard was there observing. And they're all prepared for this. It was not rushed. I'm telling the story quickly, but it was very well done. And a restorative justice process happened in that room. That woman got to ask this man the questions that she had wondered about for many years, because at this point, this was 15 years later. The questions are heartbreaking. If you want to see them, watch the video. But he answered them. And he didn't deflect, and he didn't minimize, and he didn't make excuses. And after he'd answered all of her questions, she said, I feel that God has prepared me for this. She'd been working through catechism, and as she had been learning about her faith and learning about God, she felt that God had prepared her for that very moment to meet this man. And so at the end of their 45 minutes of talking, she said, I forgive you. And he still was serving a prison term, went back to the prison, but went back, as Pierre Lard says, a different man with his head up. A man with some hope that if he was to return to his village, that he had an advocate, that he had someone who would speak against retaliation against him. Whether the harm is small or whether the harm is great, restorative justice processes are the same. Howard Zehr is the grandfather of restorative justice. He wrote a book called The Little Book of Restorative Justice. And he writes a lot of it in the context of crime. But he has 10 ways to live restoratively. I'm just going to hit the top 4. And really, it's just a reiteration. He says, take relationships seriously. Envision yourself in an interconnected web of people, institutions, and the environment. Number 2, try to be aware of the impact, potential as well as actual, of your actions on others and the environment. One of the programs the women can take at the prison is called Dialectical Behavioral Therapy, DBT. And I've learned lots sort of secondhand as women share with me what they're learning. And one of the things that they've learned is the difference between intention and impact. So it might not be my intention for a certain impact, but if that impact occurs, I'm still responsible for it. And so we need to think about the potential impact of the decisions that we make. Number 3, when your actions negatively impact others, take responsibility by acknowledging and seeking to repair the harm. And here's something that Howard adds, even when you probably could get away with avoiding or denying it. I had taken a day to pray a number of years ago, and this verse was in the section that I was reading. And so I paused for a moment, and I'm like, God, is there anyone that I'm not at peace with? And I sort of prayed, I have to confess, sort of smugly. I kind of thought I was good. And then God reminded me of a relationship where I felt like I was the offended, not the offender. But I realized that I might have had a part to play. So it was like, okay, God, what do I need to own from this? And then what do I need to do to be at peace? And I did it. And not enthusiastically, but I did it. And we're at peace. And the 4th one is treat everyone respectfully, even those you don't expect to encounter again, even those you feel don't deserve it, even those who have harmed or offended you or others. The textbook for this series, The Roadmap to Reconciliation, the author says that we need to foster safe spaces. To foster safe spaces, we must first acknowledge and validate the wrongs that have taken place between us. Maybe memories of your wake are coming back to you this morning. Intended or not, damage has happened. You have relationships that you wouldn't describe as peaceful, tense or awkward at best, toxic and hateful at worst. If it is possible, as much as it lies with you, this is an invitation to make things as right as possible. In the next few messages in this series, I understand that Tyler will be speaking on the biblical model for being reconciled one to another. You don't have to figure it out yourself. ask God to help you. There's wonderful grace available to you when you enter into the things of God. Grace and peace to you, my friends. May I pray? Father, I thank you for your mercy to us. That God, you have not given us what we deserve, but in your mercy you saved us and brought us back into relationship with yourself. Holy Spirit, lover of peace, can you show us where we might have some work to do, where we work, where we live, wherever it is, God. And then will you give us a desire to do it, the strength to do it. And God, I pray that your peace would reign in our relationships. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks so much, Debbie. So good to hear what God's doing in places we don't often get to go. We're going to do a song that we have